Recovery in pictures for scapegoat survivors of narcissistic abuse. Does the process of recovery from narcissistic abuse seem unclear at times? Do you often wonder whether you're on the right track or not? Is it often confusing how to reclaim your actual identity? Well, I like to think in pictures, and recently I haven't been able to get the image of a fork in the road out of my head as a visual for how the scapegoat child adapts to a hostile narcissistic parent. And one of the paths in the fork is conscious, while the other is unconscious. The unconscious path is the scapegoat child's developing and expanding real experience, while the conscious path requires suspending awareness of their own development and prioritizing the needs of their narcissistic parent. This fork protects the scapegoat child from becoming nobody to no one. The child and later survivor actually travel down both paths, but at first may only be aware of where they are along the conscious path. Recovery can involve participating in new relationships where the survivor can be who they are along the unconscious path without losing needed connection from others. And as this happens, the fork in the survivor's developmental road dissipates, and a landing in one's whole real self today can gradually occur. In today's video, I use visuals to show what happens to the scapegoat child, what recovery looks like, and how the 3 pillars of recovery can help scapegoat survivors get there. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. In my professional and personal experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to the process of recovery. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is making sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance from narcissistic abusers and closeness to safe people. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of the narcissist rules. I think it's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. I've seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life after applying these pillars. Today's video falls under pillar number 1, making sense of what happened. Well, if you are a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent or partner, then I encourage you to check out my free ebook on the topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as a Scapegoat, and it goes into other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoat child or partner to the narcissistic abuser. From self-limiting beliefs about yourself that you have to adopt to survive, to why the narcissistic personality is so geared to put the ones closest to them down. I think this ebook can help you realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but rather the product of the narcissist's psychological and emotional problems. And you can find the link to the book in the description box below or by clicking here. The fork in the scapegoat child's developmental road. A child born to a narcissistic parent starts their life out as who they actually are. Babies don't know how to do otherwise. And as they get a little older, they may grow more aware of how they don't get enough attention from their narcissistic parent. And this experience can set off alarms that their parent may not care about them enough for the child to feel securely attached. And if the narcissistic parent goes a step further and begins to relocate their own sense of worthlessness into the child, then the child can face another traumatizing burden. In order to be who the narcissistic parent recognizes them as, the child must identify as the bad kid the parent insists they are. Hence the devil horns and tail on the child in this picture. Assuming this identity allows the child to remain somebody to someone, even though it is a somebody who faces ongoing rebuke from the parent. So in the initial part of this fork, the path you can see here is conscious. The path that I have yet to describe fully is the unconscious path. In order to adopt the identity as the worthless scapegoat who's bad or, the devil, the child may have to believe that they are less than the narcissistic parent, defective, undeserving of respect, care, and/or protection. And this is the child's conscious identity. Meanwhile, the child has to submerge into their unconscious the developing self. That is, they cannot know that they are growing up because that would challenge the narcissistic parent's dominance. At the time, they're too dependent on that parent's willingness to attach to them to protest this hierarchy. So their actual growing self, represented by this adult here, goes into the unconscious of themselves. Expressing this self could land them in the agony of being nobody to no one in terms of their relationship to the narcissistic parent. Qualities of the unconscious developing self include expanding capacities, feeling equal to other adults, and feeling deserving of equal rights, along with feeling cared about by safe people. A marker of this unconscious developing self or developed self is often what people outside the family may say about the scapegoat individual. And these typically positive reflections may feel untrue or a product of being pleasing to these people. At the start of the recovery process, scapegoat survivors may really have no way to think positively of themselves just yet. So such feedback can seem impossible to believe. Over time, however, this feedback often serves as clues for who the developing or developed self actually is. So let's take another anonymized case example to illustrate. Sarah was a scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse in her family. She was beginning to come to terms with this and tell some of her trusted friends what her narcissistic mother had really been like to her. And one of her friends still lived in her hometown. This friend told her, every time I mention you to anyone we went to school with, they always say what a good person you are. At the time, Sarah said, yeah, well, sure. That's because all I knew at the time was how to please other people. So of course they liked me. Sarah was, in fact, a considerate and moral person whom these other friends actually recognized, but it was not yet safe for Sarah to see this as a reflection of her developed self. The goal of recovery: know the scapegoat and developed self were always the same good person. Recovery involves the recognition that the developing or developed self and the scapegoat self were always the same person. Nothing changes the time spent in the fork, but a convergence of the two selves can actually happen. As the process of recovery goes on, the scapegoat survivor eventually gets to operate from their developed self with a compassionate and appreciative understanding for how they survived their narcissistic parent as the scapegoat child. And this happens in the context of new, lasting connections to safe people. Well, now that we've seen the start of the fork and how it can eventually mend, let's look at how to get there. The three pillars of recovery each can play an important role. Pillar number one, making sense of what happened. Pillar number one involves making sense of what happened so that you know the abuse was not your fault. Here, the scapegoat survivor is still having to live in the fork, but perhaps they're learning more about narcissistic personality disorder, seeing parallels in the ways they were treated, and then perhaps also beginning to question whether they are and were as bad as their parent insisted. So this is where consuming information about narcissism and narcissistic abuse while sharing your story with fellow survivors can be particularly helpful. The survivor is creating a new frame of reference to understand themselves. Now they may no longer see themselves as the devil their parent made them out to be, but rather see the devilish behavior where it originated, in the narcissistic parent. At this stage, there can also be breakthrough times where the developed self kind of peeks out of the unconscious. The scapegoat self and the developed self begin to get acquainted. So let's go again to another anonymized case example to illustrate this part of the phase of recovery. Sean came to treatment in his mid-20s with severe anxiety. He had difficulty concentrating at work and would find reasons to work from home. And during this time, he would nap or idle the time away. He experienced a spike in his anxiety whenever he went to see friends or go on dates. And despite all of this, Sean was a very likable, intelligent, emotionally strong, and academically accomplished person. In therapy, we initially worked on ways he could cope and respond to his anxiety when it peaked. Sean made good use of diaphragmatic breathing and would often expose himself to the anxiety-provoking situations. He wanted to prove to himself that nothing catastrophic would actually happen, and it was working for him. A few months later, we began to explore his experience in his home growing up. Sean portrayed himself as lazy, fraudulent in his abilities, and having little of value to offer. I suspected that this portrayal was a compliance with being who he had to be in his family when he was growing up, because the person I saw across from me did not jibe with this description. Well, Sean recounted a childhood and adolescence filled with criticism, derision, and explosive rages from his father, while his mother was very emotionally remote, except when she wanted some sort of emotional support from Sean. He could never go to either parent for protection, understanding, or support. As we unpacked his history in session, Sean began his journey through pillar number 1. He was making sense of what happened in his upbringing and seeing that he was never as bad as his parents had treated him. Well, the best resource I know to point people to for pillar number 1 is the book Growing Up as a Scapegoat to Narcissistic Parents, A Guide to Healing. In it, I go into a lot of depth on each of the 3 pillars. Survivors can arm themselves with in-depth information on why they often feel bad, ineffectual, and inadequate. And they'll also learn how these experiences are a product of their narcissistic parents' mistreatment of them, not a reflection of who they actually are. You can find the link in the description box below or by clicking here. Pillar number 2, gaining distance from narcissistic abusers. Next, the scapegoat survivor grows more aware of narcissistic people in their life and seeks distance from them. Simultaneously, there can be a seeking of people who treat them well or safe people. The scapegoat and developed self continue to be in more contact, and the survivor may experience safe people noticing and responding to qualities of their adult or developed self. Let's go back to Sean to illustrate this. Well, he had always taken it as a solemn obligation to visit his parents twice per year. He described these visits as painfully unfulfilling for him. He felt as if he was checking a box so that they could not complain that he doesn't visit them enough and that he's a bad son. But after arriving during these visits, his mother and father would essentially then go to separate rooms, and Sean would feel left on his own for pretty much the duration of the visit. The exceptions were if a family friend came to the house and then his mother would want to parade Sean out to show what a good job of parenting she did. We also tracked that his anxiety attacks historically spiked after visiting his parents. I took the tact of wondering why his needs in the decision-making process of whether to visit his parents seemed less important than his parents' needs for him to make an appearance. Initially, Sean saw the prospect of not visiting as a cruel blow to them. But as we continued to work on this, he grew more convicted that taking care of himself is not an act of punishment of his parents or anyone else. Though they might characterize him as such, he had enough time in therapy and in his new safe relationships to assure himself that he was not doing anything harmful. Sean limited his visits to once per year, and his anxiety levels did not spike nearly as much. Well, a useful resource for pillar number 2 is my free playlist on this YouTube channel titled Gaining Distance from the Narcissistic Abuser. There are 18 free videos on this playlist, and they cover the importance of gaining distance to protect yourself. They also address common challenges that can arise in achieving distance, such as guilt, trauma bonding, a desire to prove the parent wrong about you, and more. And you can find the link to the playlist in the description box below or by clicking here. Pillar number 3, live in defiance of the narcissist rules. This pillar involves challenging and disconfirming the beliefs you had to adopt to stay somebody to your narcissistic parent. These beliefs protected you from the fate of being nobody to no one. With the other two pillars in operation, the scapegoat survivor can grow increasingly safe in identifying and challenging these beliefs. Many of these beliefs, such as I am defective, or my needs are less important than others, or I do not deserve protection, can serve to deny the existence of the survivor's developed self. The person as a developed self is clearly not defective, but functional. Their needs are equally important as others, and they're capable and willing to protect themselves. The survivor gets to bring their developed self more and more into their conscious awareness. The former danger of doing so is now mitigated by the distance they have from their narcissistic abusers. Plus, they know from pillar number one that they are no longer obligated to bolster someone else's emotional needs by serving as the devalued one to that person. Well, let's illustrate this again, going back to Sean. He began in therapy to talk about how he did not enjoy his present role at work. He loved to write and think critically, and this role offered him none of that. So he began to value his abilities and developed a confidence that he would succeed in the right position. He sought and got a transfer to a new department at his company where his job was to write technical papers for the software team. He discussed how much he liked learning about the products he had to write about and then explaining them in terms that were digestible to a wider audience. Sean got recognized for his efforts in this role by his manager and others in the company. He regarded himself as a talented writer who had a lot to offer. And this self-concept contradicted how he saw himself at the start of therapy as lazy and fraudulent. Well, a useful resource for pillar number 3 are modules 5 and 6 in my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse. In these two modules, I cover the common beliefs that can keep the scapegoat survivor psychologically at home with their narcissistically abusive parent. Next, I describe the process for identifying and disconfirming these beliefs in your own life. In Module 6, I address a major sticking point for many scapegoat survivors, and that is equating lovability with competence. The times that they were shown kindness or maybe even just spared hostility may have been conditional upon serving the interest of the narcissistic parent in some way. This can lead to a transactional view of when you deserve to receive love and when you do not. In this module, I describe how to notice, challenge, and disconfirm this view in your own process of recovery. So let's go back to the goal of recovery. Know the scapegoat and developed self were always the same person. Well, this slide probably looks familiar, but the resolution of the fork in the scapegoat child's development involves the developed self and scapegoat self fully recognizing each other. There's a mutual appreciation for who both were when they had to occupy different paths in the fork, where they had to go during the abuse, how they both fought against the abuse in their own ways, and how they can now be valued by the safe people in their lives today. The developed self gets to take the lead in life as this part is most commensurate with where the survivor is in their lifespan. They get to experience mastery, connection, and autonomy as the adult they are. Let's again go back to Sean to illustrate this. He began to have a different presence in the therapy sessions. At the outset of our work together, he seemed ready to agree with whatever I might say about my understanding of his experience. He seemed to feel it was not safe to disagree with someone whose maybe goodwill towards him he wanted to preserve. Now he would consider what I said in session and very often tell me that what I said wasn't quite right. He would clarify what he wanted me to understand, and I'd appreciate his honest feedback so that I could better understand him. In this process, there was a much flatter way that we were relating to one another as two adults rather than one having more authority than the other, and maybe even undeserving authority than the other. Sean began to talk more of his friendships that he cultivated where he was treated with respect and admiration. He also found himself protecting his own needs and autonomy in his romantic relationships. Sean was operating from his developed self while carrying an empathic understanding for the part of him that had to identify as the scapegoat in order to be somebody to his narcissistic parents. Well, I hope you found today's video useful in your own process of recovery. And as always, I want to thank everyone for your continued engagement with the channel and the resources around it. And again, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.